Good morning and welcome to the United in Purpose, the History of Community Action webinar. My name is Heather Lockard and I am the Executive Director of the Missouri Association for Community Action, or MACA. I have been with the State Association for the past 5 years, and prior to coming on board with the State Association, I worked at one of the community action agencies in the southern part of the state, Ozark Area Community Action Corporation, or OCAC. I hope that the webinar today is informative and you can continue to learn about our network and the community action movement. So why is it important to learn about the history of community action and all that we have done? Well, we do this because it is important to know where we came from, what we have accomplished, why we were created, and to learn from our roots. It is important, more now than ever, because we know that as a nation there are over 46 million people living in poverty. 46 million. We also know that we define poverty differently than our peers, our family, and friends do. That we all have a different take on what perpetuates the cycle of poverty. Several of us define poverty differently, but we all know there is one constant, that we must fight poverty for the good of our nation and our people. That is exactly what President Lyndon Johnson set out to do, because he said, "It is right, because it is wise, and because, for the first time in our history, it is possible to conquer poverty. I submit, for the consideration of Congress and this country, the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. In 1964, the Great Society, as envisioned by President Johnson, was a sweeping plan to improve the lives of all Americans, regardless of their circumstances. It was inspired by President Kennedy and his New Frontier. Johnson pledged to fulfill his promise of equal opportunity for all by enacting several comprehensive changes within the federal government. In August of that same year, the Economic Opportunity Act was signed into law by President Johnson, creating the nationwide Community Action Network and the War on Poverty. This war was waged by President Kennedy before he was assassinated. President Kennedy had asked his economic advisors to draw up some proposals to address the problem of American poverty. Johnson took this charge after he succeeded Kennedy as president. In Johnson's first State of the Union address, he called for an unconditional war to defeat poverty. Community action was a bold idea, especially for the federal government. It handed over control to the local level so that programs were geared specifically for target population needs. It was geared to incorporate local level input to ensure the local needs were met through the most appropriate solutions determined by members of that community. This concept, maximum feasible participation, represented a new paradigm in the government, and many sectors were weary of its innovative ideas. President Johnson selected a member of President Kennedy's inner circle, Sargent Shriver, to head the war on poverty. Shriver was head of the Peace Corps and had proved to be a capable leader. He was installed as the first head of the Office of Economic Opportunity in October 1964 and leapt into action, after some coercing, which we will see in the following video clip.
positive in terms of bringing Kennedy to the campaign. It was also negative because he knew that if he chose Sarge over Bobby, there would be conflicts within the family, jealousies within the family. Many of the Kennedy people felt that if anybody should be on the ticket, it was Bobby.
That message was delivered to the White House and to Schreiber, putting him in that position. He told Bobby, the president, and reporters, "I'm not running for anything." But Johnson kept Schreiber's name in play and took months to make a decision.
There was a real game going on in his head. He was really intrigued about the prospects, and he was tempted.
Johnson only turned back from the fear that there would be great opposition from within his family. And the moment passed that there was a moment when Sarge was likely to become the Vice President of the United States.
The president concluded he wanted Schreiber in another role, to run a war on poverty.
I will announce your appointment to a press conference. What press conference? Say it, man. Well, the problem is that, that's a crap out of Peace Corps, and I'm not taking it away from that. I'm just giving you $1 billion more to work with. And if you can't run a $100 million program in your left hand and $1 billion in your right hand, you're not as smart as I think you are. I think he saw the perfect match between what Schreiber had done on the Hill for the Peace Corps, what he could do for the world of poverty. Well, I'm going to make it clear that you must poverty. But how am I prepared, you know what I mean? You got your responsibility, you got your authority, you got the power, you got the money. Now, you may not have the glands. The glands? Yeah. But I'm going to play a gland, you know. I guess he could have said no, but one didn't say no to Lyndon Johnson. You just didn't.
Sarge told you this. You don't really want to run this thing. I'm going to call the president back and tell him that.
How long do you think you want me to do it? How many do you want to? The people are going to go to the military support. I think there will be fights for the power. You just go ahead and embrace it. You ready? I'm still going to let you know. Okay.
I conferred at length with Sergeant Schreiber, and I have asked him to serve as special assistant to the president in the organization and the administration of the War on Poverty program, which I announced in my State of the Union message. Schreiber began immediately to study the In 1964, 30 million Americans lived in poverty. Although most of the poor were white, the power of the Civil Rights Movement raised the issue to a place on the national agenda and stirred the new president to action.
Can you help us free these Americans from the prison of poverty? And if you can, let me hear your message.
As a young man, Johnson had taught Mexican-American children in rural Texas. Later as a congressman, he idolized Franklin Roosevelt and dreamed of completing the New Deal. He named his vision for a better America, the Great Society. It included civil rights, voting rights, civil freedoms, Lyndon Johnson was a master at working legislation for Congress. He had no blueprint for ending poverty.
The general was asked, I want you to launch a war on Grenada. Could you invade it, take it over? That's something you get your mind around. But a war on poverty, that's not saying, could you, President Ford said, could you wage war on gravity?
this was no longer just a political assignment or something we do because the president asked, but this was something that had to be done and done right, and became very passionate about it. People are interested in being treated as human beings. They're interested in having other people treat them, as the Declaration of Independence says, as equals. That's the first thing that's needed in the war against poverty. The civil rights movement has really elevated the notion of equality, and he wants to extend that spirit now to programs to end poverty nationwide.
As you can see, the Act did not merely expand old programs or improve what was already being done. It was about innovation, charting a new course to strike at not only the consequences of poverty, but the causes and conditions. It is about bettering both the individual and the community. Community Action's purpose and mission were clear from the beginning. In order to reduce poverty in its community, a community action agency will work to better focus all available local, state, private, and federal resources to assist low-income families to acquire useful skills and knowledge, gain access to new opportunities, and achieve economic self-sufficiency. Our mission is about both the community and the people. The Office of Economic Opportunity Act was an innovative legislation. It established the Office of Economic Opportunity, which was headed by Sergeant Shriver and oversaw various programs. The Act also had its own philosophy, which was about community action agencies determining the use of their funding at the local level. Many community action agencies opened in neighborhood centers or in storefronts so that they could ensure they were able to involve and mobilize all community members. Community action agencies involved various members of the community, including low-income individuals, so that they could be aware of the realities of poverty and involve those individuals to be part of the solution. There were several programs which were started through the Economic Opportunity Act. Some were started by community action agencies and became their own organizations. Programs like Head Start, Legal Services, VISTA, Family Planning, Neighborhood Youth Corps, Basic Education and Job Training, and Job Corps. Unfortunately, the Economic Opportunity Act received only about $1 billion to be divided among the various programs and remained critically underfunded. Many have said that President Johnson waged a war that he could not afford the weapons to really fight. By 1966, Congress appropriated $4 billion for the programs. The Economic Opportunity Act and Community Action have been through an evolution of sorts. In 1967, the Economic Opportunity Act was amended to mandate the board structure of community action agencies, which complemented the earlier Quay Amendment and required tripartite representation, including low-income representation, which we will discuss in a moment. In 1973, President Nixon's administration did not require any funds for community action programs and set out to do away with the program, although Congress had appropriated money. Nixon transferred several of the larger programs we discussed earlier, like Head Start, VISTA, and Legal Services, from the Office of Economic Opportunity to the Departments of Health, Education, Welfare, and Labor, which essentially fragmented the philosophy and effectiveness of these programs. President Nixon appointed Howard Phillips as the Director of Economic Opportunity and told him to dismantle the Community Action Program and close the agency and not to spend any of the money that Congress had provided. So, in response to this threat, several individuals from the National Community Action Network set out to save community action. 2 executive directors decided to sue President Nixon, and one of those directors was from Missouri. Mr. Charles Braithwaite, who worked as the executive director at West Central Community Action Agency, filed suit against President Nixon and mobilized and empowered other executive directors, community action agency staff from across the country to advocate and lobby for the livelihood of community action. He encouraged staff, low-income individuals, and community members to write letters and call their congressmen about community action. After a lot of time and energy, the Federal District Court in Washington, D.C. ruled that the president could not refuse to spend funds that had been appropriated by Congress. Funding again flowed to community action agencies. Howard Phillips resigned, and I guess we all know what happened to President Nixon. In the wake of these changes, in 1974, President Ford passed the Community Services Amendment, and the Office of Economic Opportunity was changed to the Community Services Administration, and community action agencies continued to be funded under this new administration until 1981. In 1981, President Reagan introduced the block grant, which dramatically changed the way the federal funding was distributed. Reagan's administration proposed to reduce the federal government support for domestic social programs and consolidate them into several large general-purpose block grants, reducing the total amount of government funding by 25%. The individual states were to be responsible for the administration of the Community Services Block Grant, where regional offices used to administer the CSBG program. In 1998, the CSBG Act was reauthorized, and we have been operating under continuing resolutions ever since then. So what is a block grant? A block grant is a large sum of money granted by the national government to a state or regional government with provisions as to the way it is to be spent. In the case of the Community Services Block Grant, the Federal Office of Community Services, which is housed in the Department of Health and Human Services, grants money to each state. The state then in turn grants 90% of that money to the local community action agencies with certain federal and state requirements. The amount of funds that each state receives is determined by a federal formula. Likewise, the amount of money that each local community action agency receives is determined by a state formula. Each state appoints an office to oversee the Community Services Block Grant. In Missouri, it is located in the Division of Social Services in the Community Support Unit. Other examples of block grants are the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, CDGB, and LIHEAP. The Community Services Block Grant is flexible and locally guided, ensuring the innovative programs community action agencies develop and administer with the Community Services Block Grant are unique to the needs of each community and address a broad range of social services. Missouri receives over $17 million in Community Services Block Grant funds, but we were able to leverage over $23 million in local private sector funds, which, as we stated earlier, is one of the primary missions of community action agencies, to leverage all available resources to fight poverty in each community. Community Services Block Grant represents less than 1/4% of the discretionary spending in the federal budget, but it makes up to 100% of a community action agency's identity. To be clear, CSBG is one funding source that community action agencies received, and in most situations, it can be one of the smaller amounts of money that that agency receives. However, it is one of the most important funding streams because it is what makes you a community action agency. If you do not receive Community Services Block Grant dollars, you cannot consider yourself a community action agency. Community Services Block Grant allows agencies to work closely with other local organizations, government offices, businesses, and schools in developing relationships and networks to support those families in need. There are three purposes of the Community Services Block Grant: to reduce poverty, to revitalize low-income communities, and empower low-income families and individuals to become self-sufficient. We are able to achieve these purposes through strengthening community capabilities for planning and coordinating a broad range of assistance related to the elimination of poverty, so assistance can be responsive to local needs and conditions. By organizing a range of services related to the needs of low-income people, greater use of innovative and effective community-based approaches to attacking the causes and effects of poverty, maximum participation of residents of low-income communities and members of the groups served to empower them to respond to their community's unique problems and needs, broadening resource base and programs directed to the elimination of poverty. Since 1968, local community action agencies have been required to have a tripartite governing boards to gain and retain designation as eligible entities and to receive Community Services Block Grant funding. Effective tripartite boards reflect and promote the unique anti-poverty leadership, action, and mobilization responsibilities assigned by law to community action agency. The board is composed of 1/3 low-income individuals and families. A minimum of 1/3 of tripartite board membership must be democratically selected representatives of low-income individuals and families who reside in the geographic area being served by the agency. 1/3 elected officials or their representatives. 1/3 must be elected officials holding office at the time of selection or their representative. If a sufficient number of elected officials or their representatives are not available to serve, appointed public officials or their representatives may take the place of the elected officials. And the remaining balance is made up of major groups and interests in the community served. The remaining board members must be chosen from businesses, industry, labor, religious, law enforcement, education, or other major groups of interest in the community served. Community Action Agency boards are responsible for assuring that the agencies continue to assess and respond to the causes and conditions of poverty in their community, achieve anticipated family and community outcomes, and remain administratively and fiscally sound. So what makes you a community action agency? Once you have received designation as a community action agency from local or state government, that you are recognized as an eligible entity by the Community Services Block Grant Act and can receive funding from the state under CSBG, that you have a tripartite board, and that you belong to a national and state network of similar agencies, like the Missouri Association for Community Action or the Community Action Partnership. We have come a long way in our 50 years as a Community Action Network. Today there are over 1,100 community action agencies, which are both nonprofit organizations, like all of Missouri's community action agencies, and public community action agencies. The Community Services Block Grant Program is now administered by the Office of Community Services, and we are the only program where we have the expectation to end poverty. Most other organizations focus on one need, but we focus on all needs that may move an individual out of poverty, like we talked about at the beginning of this webinar. No other organization has such a mandate. In Missouri, we have 19 community action agencies that cover every county in the state of Missouri. Services may vary based on the local need of each community, but we are all working to fight poverty in Missouri. I think that was one of the most amazing things that I realized once I came from the Community Action Agency in the southwest part of the state to the state association, that there are people just like you in every county in the state of Missouri working to fight poverty. People just like you that care about low-income families and their community. Services range for each of these community action agencies depending on their local needs. So why are community action agencies unique? We are unique because together we are able to revitalize communities, empower families, and reduce poverty. We can equip low-income individuals with the tools and potential for becoming self-sufficient. We have a coordinated effort to address the root effects of poverty and to ultimately move families and individuals to self-sufficiency. This work is not easy, and demand is always shifting and changing, but we do have several key components that make us who we are. One is that we are flexible. CSBG is unique. It is flexible, and it primarily funds local investments in services, facilities, and partnerships which are particular to the Community Action Agency's home community. Communities can provide its low-income members the right mix of assistance, encouragement, and incentives to become self-sufficient. We can respond immediately to needs. Take the tornado that hit Joplin, Missouri in May of 2011. Economic Security Corporation was there to meet the immediate needs of the community as well as spearhead their rebuilding efforts. Community action agencies are also community catalysts who coordinate community members to create change. There are all kinds of services that community action agencies are doing today. We are doing things like creating jobs, conducting leadership programs to develop low-income individuals, helping low-income families start their own businesses, developing safe, affordable, quality housing units for low-income individuals, providing much-needed health services, as well as early childhood education. This is just a sample of some of the programs that community action agencies do. But together, we are creating innovative approaches and solutions to end poverty in Missouri. So why does it matter to meet the multiple needs of low-income individuals? What's the difference that we're making? Well, we know it matters because there are over 900,000 Missourians living in poverty. Over 300,000 of them are children. Our unemployment rate is currently 6.1%. Over 15% of Missourians are uninsured, and over 16% of households are food insecure. I know we have only touched briefly on the history of community action and why it is important for all of us to understand our history, so that we can fully understand where we are going in the future, especially as we work to protect the future of community action. Which is why we must show how community action success is not measured just by services, but by the improvements in the lives of the people served, and no less importantly, in the changes in the community attitudes and practices towards the challenges of poverty. Together, we can fulfill the promise of community action, which is community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. Together, we can also achieve our statewide vision, which is United in Purpose. The Community Action Network will inspire and engage people to ensure that all families and communities thrive. We really appreciate you participating in this webinar today, and we would love to hear any feedback or questions that you may have. So we are going to unmute everyone and allow for you to ask them questions.